If you're a high-achieving woman who's exhausted by stress, stuck in constant conflict, and tired of being overlooked in the exact rooms where you know you were born to lead, then this podcast is for you. So here's your host, Pallavi Jain.
Welcome back to Her Boss Brain. I'm your host, Pallavi. Today is a little different. This is our 50th episode. When I first hit record almost a year ago, I honestly didn't know where this journey would take us. I knew I wanted to have conversations about leadership, neuroscience, performance, and the inner world that shapes how we show up at work and at home. What I didn't expect was that, 50 conversations would end up revealing one consistent pattern. So, over the past 49 episodes, we have talked about burnout, communication, leadership, conflict, performance, confidence, decision making, accountability, overthinking, resilience, motherhood, identity, and performance. And we've had incredible guests, right? From CEOs to chief human resource officers, people officers, physicians, chief wellness officers, entrepreneurs, coaches, university leaders, law firm experts, attorneys, executives leading through extraordinary challenges, and people navigating deeply personal ones. Now, on the surface, every conversation was different. But as I started preparing for this milestone episode, I did something, a little bit deeper. So I went back through all those conversations looking for patterns. And somewhere along the way, you know, I realized something that I hadn't spent the last year creating 50 different conversations. I had spent the last year asking the same question from different angles. And once I saw it, it was very clear, right? What's interesting is that these conversations didn't change what I believed. They strengthened it, challenged it, and ultimately gave me much clearer language for something I've been observing in leaders for years, right? The, the core of my work hasn't changed over the last 2 years. What has changed is, my ability to explain it. And as I started seeing those connections more clearly, I realized they explained not just leadership, but why we think, perceive, decide, communicate, and ultimately lead the way we do under pressure. Have you ever had, one of those moments where something suddenly clicks, right? Where you've been looking at individual puzzle pieces for months, sometimes maybe years, and then one day you step back and you realize they were all part of the same picture. That's what happened to me, right? What evolved wasn't the purpose, it was the clarity. Each conversation added another piece of the puzzle, and eventually the connections became impossible to ignore. So, a question that I don't think we ask nearly enough is what actually allows some people to remain clear, intentional, and effective when the pressure is on, while others lose access to the very capabilities they already have? Not because they are less intelligent, not because they care less, not because they haven't been trained, right? Something else is happening. And I think we have been overlooking it. That pattern is emerging and is out there in front of us, which we cannot ignore. So almost every guest started by talking about an external challenge, a difficult team, a career transition, burnout, performance, a business problem, a leadership challenge. But if you listened carefully, the conversation never stayed there. Eventually, every single one of them, right, found their way back to something happening inside themselves. I'll give you an example. When Julia Dupre recently joined me, we talked about organizational change and building high performing teams and her own leadership. But what stayed with me wasn't a leadership tactic, it was her reflection that resilience wasn't something she suddenly developed when she became a chief people officer. It has been shaped over years through experiences that taught her how to keep showing up, learning, adapting, even when circumstances were difficult. The quality of our leadership is deeply connected to the quality of the person leading, right? Then I thought about our conversation with Erica Glenn. On paper, her story looked like one of extraordinary success. A chief operating officer, a high achiever, a two-time TEDx speaker herself with millions of views and popularity, and someone who had accomplished what many people spend their lives pursuing. But beneath that success was another story, one about identity, about achievement becoming intertwined with self worth, about pushing so hard that her body eventually forced her to stop. That conversation wasn't really about burnout. It was about what happens when our internal world can no longer support the life we have built. Different story, but same pattern. Then I started thinking about my own solo episodes, right? So remember the episode about difficult conversations? So I thought I was teaching communication, but I wasn't. I was teaching what has to happen before communication. Because if we are flooded with emotion, if we're already decided we are right, if you've created a story about another person's intention because, you know, for whatever reason, before they have even spoken, then no communication technique in the world is going to help us. The conversation has already been shaped by something happening inside us. Even the episode on perception wasn't really about perception. It was about how quickly our brain fills in the gap. So, my boss hasn't replied. That's a fact. They must be disappointed in me. That's a story. And how often do we make decisions based on the story instead of the fact? And as I kept reading through these transcripts, I found myself writing the same note over and over in the margins. Different topic, same pattern. Every conversation that began with a workplace challenge eventually led back to human capability. And that's when, one thought stopped me in my tracks. Maybe we have been trying to solve the symptoms without spending enough time strengthening the human being underneath them. And, I found myself asking a question I hadn't asked before. What if communication isn't always the communication problem? What if conflict isn't always the conflict problem? What if accountability isn't always the accountability problem? Now, before you misunderstand me, of course, those things matter. Organizations absolutely need better leaders. We need stronger communication. We need healthier teams, better decision making, better managers. And I've spent my own career in the HR and leadership development helping organizations build exactly those capabilities. But over the past 2 years, I kept noticing something. No matter where the conversation started, it almost always found its way back to the same place, the human being. Not the title, not the role, not the strategy, the person. Because before every difficult conversation, there is a thought. Before every decision, there's an interpretation. Before every conflict, right, there's a story we have created. Before every reaction, there's a nervous system trying to protect us. And that's where I think we sometimes overlook something that's even more important. And as I thought about this, I started reflecting on my own career. So early in HR, I believed my role was to help people solve workplace problems. If someone wasn't communicating well, then, let's improve communication in that team. Someone struggled with conflict. Okay, let's, teach them conflict resolution. Someone wasn't managing effectively. Well, let's build the manager capacity and capabilities. Those interventions absolutely matter. They still do. Today, I don't believe something different. I simply understand the connection much more clearly. Because those skills don't exist in isolation. They are expressed through a human being. And that human being brings something into every meeting, every decision, relationship. They're bringing their beliefs, their fears, assumptions, attention, their capacity. The skill is important, but the person using the skill determines whether they can access it when pressure is highest. Knowledge alone isn't enough. We don't always perform at the level of what we know. We perform at the level of the internal capacity we can access in that moment. Now, while reading one script or another, or while reading all of them together, the deeper question was always the same. Who are we becoming underneath the skill? Right? Because maybe lasting change doesn't begin with teaching people one more leadership competency. Maybe it begins by helping people strengthen the internal capabilities that allow every other competency to come alive when it matters the most. And now at this point, an analogy that I've shared many times before that comes to mind, which is the ATM. So when you walk up to an ATM and you insert your card, the machine doesn't decide what to give you. It simply gives you access to what's already there. Now, if you've made deposits over the time, then those resources are available to you. But if you haven't, the ATM cannot create them for you in the moment you need them. Pressure works much the same way. Pressure doesn't suddenly create patience. It doesn't suddenly create courage. It doesn't suddenly create emotional regulation, wisdom, or self-awareness. Pressure doesn't create your capacity. It reveals it. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions we have about leadership and performance. Because we often assume that people will rise to the occasion. But in reality, they draw from the inner resources they have built over time. That's why, you have two experienced leaders and they can walk into the exact same situation, the same difficult conversation, same organizational change, same uncertainty. And they're both taking, by the way, leadership programs, they have read the same books, both know the communication models. Yet, one becomes reactive while the other remains grounded. One narrows their perspective while the other becomes more curious. One protects their ego while the other protects the relationship. The difference isn't necessarily what they know, it's what they can access under pressure. That realization has brought incredible clarity to something I've been teaching from the very beginning. When I created Lead from Within, I intentionally began with leading yourself before leading others, because I believed that effective leadership starts long before we influence another person. Now, what these conversations, all the work that I've done with organizations, executives in the last 2 years, all the workshops, programs, keynotes, everything, when you combine all of that, what they gave me wasn't a different philosophy. They gave me a clearer explanation for why that sequence matters. They helped me connect the science, the stories, and the everyday workplace challenges into one practical chain that I can now articulate much more simply. So whether we are talking about leadership, communication, burnout, confidence, accountability, decision making, we kept coming back to the same place: how we think. Because the quality of our thinking shapes everything that comes after it, right? When you're under pressure, what changes first? Usually it's not your communication, it's your thinking. You start making assumptions, you jump to conclusions, you become certain before you have all the information. Your attention narrows. Your brain starts looking for evidence that confirms the story that it's already created. And before you know it, you're now communicating from that story. You're making decisions from that place. You're leading from there. And that's why I've said many times on this podcast that your brain is an incredible storyteller. And when all of this happens, there comes the second thing. Because once we think, we begin to perceive. We don't experience the world exactly as it is. We experience it through the lens of our beliefs, our past experiences, our assumptions, our emotions, and then the meaning we assign to what happens around us. Remember the example I shared, in one of my previous episodes when I said that your manager hasn't responded to your email? That's the event, right? Now, one person thinks they're probably busy. Another thinks, I must have done something wrong. A third one thinks, they don't respect me. Same event, three completely different realities. Nothing changed except perception. And then perception changes everything because we don't respond to events. We respond to the meaning we have created about those events. And then with all of this, first thinking, then perception, and that's where the third layer comes in, which is decision. Every single day, we're making hundreds of decisions. Some are obvious, most aren't. Do I speak up? Do I stay silent? Do I ask another question? Do I get curious? Do I send the email now? Do I wait until tomorrow? Do I walk into this meeting already defensive or intentionally open? These aren't just leadership decisions. These are human decisions, and they're happening all day long. And most of them so quickly that we don't even notice we have made them. And that is why the pause is so powerful in these moments. That was another pattern I saw, whether I was talking with CEOs, physicians, entrepreneurs, or HR leaders, when I kept asking them, what is one wisdom or one thing that keeps you successful and sane and, keeps you going, we kept hearing one word from all of them: pause. Different language, different stories, but same practice. Now, nobody called it the ATM framework, nobody used my language, yet almost every one of them described creating space between what happened and how they responded. That was fascinating to me. Not because pausing solves the problem, because the pause gives us access to a decision we didn't even realize we had. And now, once we have made that decision, this is now it becomes visible through our communication, our behavior, our leadership. Think about every difficult conversation you have ever had, right? The words matter. Of course they do. But so does the person speaking them. Have you ever had someone say all the right things, yet something still felt off? Or maybe the opposite, right? Maybe you've experienced someone who didn't have the perfect words, but you could feel their sincerity, their presence, their intention. Because communication is never just about words, it's about the human being behind the words. And that's why I've often said your nervous system enters the room before your words do. And that's why leadership is never the starting point. Leadership is the outcome. It's a visible expression of everything that came before it. How we thought, how we perceived, the choices we made, how we communicated. When those things strengthen, leadership strengthens naturally. Not because we memorized another model, but because we have become someone who can access our best thinking when pressure is highest, when chaos is there, when ambiguity is there. And this is what became so clear when I looked back over my journey of these 50 episodes, of the conversations I've had, the work I've done. And as I thought about that, I found myself remembering, something that Annette Gregg also mentioned when she joined us on the podcast. We talked about leading an industry through extraordinary uncertainty, disruption, and constant change and evolution. But what stood out wasn't that she had all the answers. It was how often she returned to the importance of staying grounded, remaining curious, listening well, and resisting the urge to react too quickly when the pressure was high. Different challenge, same pattern. The leaders who navigate uncertainty most effectively aren't necessarily the ones with the most experience or the loudest voice. They are the ones who can stay connected to their best thinking when everyone else is being pulled into fear, assumptions, or urgency. And so looking back, these all were never separate ideas. They are connected. Each one builds on the one before it. The quality of our thinking influences our perception. Our perception shapes our decision. Our decisions shape our communication. And over time, our communication shapes the kind of leader we become. Which means if we want to transform our leadership, we can't start with leadership alone. We have to start much earlier in the chain and fill this missing gap at the place where every response begins, inside ourselves. And, as I look ahead, I don't think these ideas are becoming less important. I think they're becoming essential. Think about it, right? We're entering a world where information is no longer scarce. In fact, it's everywhere. Artificial intelligence can summarize reports in seconds. It can generate presentations, analyze data, write code, draft emails, create marketing campaigns. The technical side of work will continue to evolve faster than any of us can keep up. And that's exciting. But it also forces us to ask a different question. If information becomes easier to access, what becomes more valuable? I don't think the answer is simply learning more. I think the answer is learning to think better. Because AI can generate options. It can't decide which options align with your values. It can't build trust with a colleague who's struggling. It can't repair a relationship that's been damaged. It can't choose courage over comfort. And it can't decide whether to react or to respond. Those are deeply human capabilities. And I believe those capabilities are becoming the real competitive advantage. Because the future won't simply reward the people who know the most. It will reward the people who can remain clear when others become overwhelmed, who can stay curious when everyone else rushes to certainty, who can regulate themselves before responding, who can separate facts from stories their minds create, and who can build trust in an increasingly automated world. That's the human advantage. And maybe, that's what these 50 episodes have really been exploring all along. Not how to compete with technology, but how to strengthen the very capabilities that make us uniquely human. So, as I was preparing this episode, I found myself smiling because this podcast has changed me just as much as I hope it's helped some of you. One of the unexpected gifts of hosting this podcast has been that it forced me to slow down and reflect on my own thinking. Not because I was searching for a new direction, but because every conversation, right, sharpened the one I was already on. Each guest challenged an assumption, confirmed a pattern, or gave language to an idea I'd been trying to express. And somewhere along the way, those ideas stopped feeling like individual topics and started feeling like one connected body of work. Early on, I thought I was teaching leadership. Then I became fascinated by the science behind why people think, react, perform the way they do under pressure. And over time, these ideas have started to connect. Today, if someone asks me what I do, my answer is much simpler than it used to be. I help people strengthen the internal capabilities that determine how they think, perceive, choose, communicate, and decide, and ultimately perform and lead under pressure. Because that's what everything else is built on. Communication doesn't begin when we speak, it begins with how we think. Leadership doesn't begin when someone gives us a title, it begins with how we lead ourselves. Culture doesn't begin with values written on the wall, it begins with the choices people make every single day. And organizations don't transform because someone introduced another framework or technological advancement. They transform because people begin showing up differently. And that's the evolution I didn't fully see when this podcast began. Not because the ideas changed, but because the connections became clearer. So looking back, I realize every episode was another piece of the same puzzle. Every guest added another perspective. Every solo episode challenged another assumption. And together, they helped me see something I could not have seen from just one conversation alone. So here we are, 50 episodes later, and strangely, I don't feel like I've reached the end of an idea. I feel like I've finally found the question I've been trying to answer all along. Not how do we become better leaders, but how do we become the kind of people who can think clearly, perceive accurately, choose intentionally, and communicate effectively, lead wisely when the pressure is on? Because if we can answer that question, leadership improves, communication improves, relationships improve, teams improve. And ultimately, our life and organizations improve. So for me, that's what Lead from Within has always been about. Not perfection, not pretending that pressure doesn't exist, but building the inner capacity to meet pressure with greater awareness, greater intention, and greater wisdom. And if there is one thing these last 50 conversations have reinforced, it's this. Pressure is inevitable, but how we think, how we perceive, the choices we make, and how we show up, those are the capacities we can strengthen. And maybe that's where your work begins. Not by trying to become someone different overnight, but by becoming a little more aware of how you're thinking, the stories you're telling yourself, and the choices available to you the next time pressure shows up. Because leadership isn't built in one defining moment, it's built in thousands of these ordinary moments that most people never notice. So the next time you're under pressure this week, pause for 5 seconds and ask yourself, what fact do I know? What story am I adding? What choice becomes available if that story isn't true? Okay? Now, before we close, I simply want to say thank you. Whether you've listened since episode 1 or this is the very first conversation you have joined, thank you for spending your time with me. Thank you to every guest who shared their experience with honesty and authenticity. And thank you to everyone who's reached out with stories about conversations you approached differently, decisions you made more intentionally, or moments where you chose to pause instead of react. Those stories remind me why this work matters. So if something from today's conversation resonated with you, I'd love for you to share this episode with someone who's navigating season of pressure or change, because I believe these are conversations more people need to be having, not just at work, but at home, in our relationships, and in the communities we are building together. Until next time, keep leading from within, because how you think, perceive, decide, and communicate under pressure ultimately shapes the leader and the person you become. Take care, everyone.
So that's it for today's episode of her Boss Brain podcast. Head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, or wherever you listen and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes will win a chance in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 private VIP day with Pallavi herself. Be sure to head on over to herbossbrainpodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Pallavi's gift and join us next time.